I remember the moment everyone said the war was over, because for 48 hours the world actually believed it. Prices dropped, markets calmed down, people celebrated in the streets. But what I saw next didn't feel like peace at all. It felt like something much bigger had just started. I remember the moment everyone said the war was over, because for 48 hours the world actually believed it. Prices dropped, markets calmed down, people celebrated in the streets. But what I saw next didn't feel like peace at all. It felt like something much bigger had just started. The more I looked into it, the more confusing it became, because this ceasefire everyone was celebrating didn't actually have anything solid behind it. No official document, no signed agreement, no clear terms, just announcements, statements, and posts online. And that's when it hit me, how do two enemies stop a war, without even agreeing on what stopping means? From what I could piece together, the deal was supposed to last just 2 weeks. 2 weeks of no attacks, 2 weeks to calm things down, 2 weeks to maybe start real negotiations. But even that wasn't clear. Each side seemed to be describing a completely different version of the same deal. One side claimed victory, the other side claimed the same thing. And I kept thinking, both can't be right. Then I found out something even more surprising. This deal wasn't arranged by the usual global powers. It wasn't Oman. It wasn't in Qatar. It was Pakistan, stepping in and trying to hold everything together. And somehow, in a matter of hours, a deal was announced to the world, without clarity, without structure, and without trust. That's not how peace agreements usually work. That's how misunderstandings begin. And when there's no written agreement, no clear rules, both sides start filling in the gaps with their own version of the truth. Which means one thing: this wasn't really a ceasefire. It was two different stories, being told at the same time. And sooner or later, those stories were going to collide. To really understand what's happening, I had to go back to where this all began. Because this ceasefire didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of something much bigger, something far more intense than most people realize. I remember tracing it back to late February. That's when everything changed. A massive military operation was launched. Fast, coordinated, and overwhelming. Hundreds of strikes in just hours. Strategic targets were hit. Military infrastructure was targeted. And the message was clear. This wasn't a warning. This was an all-out attempt to break the system. And for a moment it looked like it might actually work. But then came the response. And this is where things escalated beyond control. Missiles, drones, attacks, spreading across multiple regions. What started as a single operation turned into a full-scale regional conflict. I remember thinking, this isn't just retaliation, this is a chain reaction. Targets expanded. Alliances got pulled in. New fronts started opening. And suddenly it wasn't just two sides anymore. It was becoming something much harder to contain. Energy routes were threatened. Global markets reacted instantly. And the ripple effects started hitting countries that weren't even directly involved. That's when it hit me, this wasn't just a war on the battlefield. This was a war affecting the entire world. And after weeks of escalation, losses, and pressure building from every direction, both sides finally paused, not because everything was resolved, but because the situation was getting too big to control. And that pause is what they later called a ceasefire. But once you see what led up to it, you start to realize something uncomfortable. A war that intense doesn't just end in 2 weeks. It waits. At this point I stopped looking at the headlines and started focusing on the details. Because what I found was unsettling. This ceasefire everyone was talking about was actually built on very limited promises. From what I understood, both sides agreed to pause their military actions temporarily, just a short window, no strikes, no escalation, a chance to breathe. On paper, it sounded simple. But then I started asking the real question. What exactly did they agree on? And more importantly, what did they not agree on? There was no clear resolution about the core issues, no final decision, no long-term plan, just a pause without solving anything. Even the conditions were shaky. One side said they would stop only if the other side stopped completely, which means trust wasn't there at all. It was conditional, fragile, almost forced. And then came the contradictions. Almost immediately, different officials started saying different things. Some claimed the agreement included safe movement through critical trade routes. Others hinted there were limitations. Some said everything was under control, while reports on the ground suggested otherwise. That's when it became obvious to me. This wasn't a solid agreement. It was a temporary understanding, full of gaps. And in those gaps, confusion started growing. Because when rules aren't clear, every action becomes questionable. Every move can be seen as a violation. Every statement can trigger tension again. And that's exactly what started happening. Within a very short time, accusations began. Blame started shifting. And the same ceasefire that was supposed to calm things down started becoming a source of new conflict. That's when I realized something critical. The strength of a ceasefire isn't in what it promises, it's in what it resolves. And this one resolved almost nothing. That's when I stopped asking what the ceasefire included and started asking what it left out. Because sometimes what's missing tells you everything. And this is where things got serious. There was no agreement on the biggest issue at the center of all of this. No final decision. No compromise. Not even a clear direction. Both sides were still holding positions that completely contradicted each other. And I kept thinking, how do you pause a war when the main reason for the war is still unresolved? It didn't make sense. Then I noticed something else. There was another front, another conflict that wasn't even properly included in the ceasefire. And yet, it was directly connected to everything. One side considered it part of the deal. The other side didn't even acknowledge it. That's not a small misunderstanding, that's a structural flaw. Because when one battlefield is paused and another one is still active, the war never really stops. It just shifts, and that's exactly what started happening. Operations continued in certain areas. Responses were threatened. Tensions kept building under the surface, and suddenly the ceasefire started looking less like peace and more like a temporary cover, a moment to regroup, to reposition, to prepare for what comes next. That's when it became clear to me, this wasn't designed to end the conflict, it was designed to manage it, to buy time. And time in a situation like this doesn't reduce pressure, it builds it. Because the longer these core issues stay unresolved, the more dangerous the next phase becomes. And the worst part, everyone involved knows it. Up to this point, it looked like two sides trying to control a situation. But then I realized something most people weren't paying attention to. There was another player, one who wasn't bound by this ceasefire in the same way. And that changed everything. Because while negotiations were being discussed, actions on the ground were still continuing. Not quietly, but openly. Statements were made that made one thing very clear. This pause wasn't seen as the end. It was just another phase. And that's when I understood the real risk. If even one major player decides not to follow the same rules, the entire structure collapses. It doesn't matter what was agreed behind closed doors. It doesn't matter what was announced publicly. All it takes is one decision, one strike, one escalation, and everything resets. And here's what made it more complicated. Not everyone had the same priorities. Not everyone had the same priorities. Some were focused on avoiding a larger global crisis. Others were focused on achieving long-term strategic goals. Those two things don't always align. So even allies weren't fully on the same page. And when that happens, control becomes an illusion. Because now it's not just about agreements anymore, it's about intentions. And intentions are unpredictable. That's when I started seeing the bigger picture. This ceasefire wasn't just fragile because of enemies, it was fragile because of enemies, it was fragile because of differences between partners. Which means the biggest threat to this pause might not come from direct conflict, but from misalignment, from decisions made independently, from actions taken without coordination. And once that starts happening, there's no controlling where things go next. At this point, I stopped asking what was happening and started asking something more important. Where is this actually going? Because once you see all the gaps, all the contradictions, all the pressure building underneath, you realize this situation doesn't have many stable outcomes. In fact, I could only see three possible paths forward. The first path, the one everyone hopes for, this is the version being sold to the world. The ceasefire holds. Tensions slowly cool down. Talks begin, and somehow progress is made. Not a perfect deal, but enough to keep things from exploding again. It would require restraint, patience, and compromise from everyone involved. And honestly, that's a lot to ask, because every side would have to accept something less than what they want. Still, this is the outcome markets are betting on. This is the version people want to believe in. The second path, the quiet breakdown, this one doesn't make headlines. Nothing dramatic happens. No big announcement. No official end. Things just slowly fall apart. Small violations continue. Trust fades even more. Talks happen but go nowhere. and eventually the ceasefire just expires. No one declares it dead, but everyone knows it is. Then the conflict returns, not all at once, but in pieces. Different regions, different fronts, a slow return to instability, and the world just adjusts to it, like it always does. The third path, the breaking point, this is the one that worries me the most, because it only takes one moment, one strike that goes too far, one response that can't be ignored, one decision made under pressure, and suddenly everything escalates again. But this time, it doesn't stay contained. Now bigger choices have to be made, sides have to be picked, alliances are tested, and the consequences become global. This isn't just a regional conflict anymore. And because this isn't just a regional conflict anymore, this becomes something much harder to control. And standing there, looking at these three paths, I realized something uncomfortable. The most stable outcome is also the least likely, because it requires everything to go right in a situation where almost everything has already gone wrong. At this point, I stopped seeing this as a ceasefire and started seeing it for what it really is, a countdown. Because when I looked at everything together, the unanswered questions, the ongoing tensions, the pressure building behind the scenes, nothing actually pointed to peace. It pointed to delay, temporary relief, not resolution. And that's dangerous, because when pressure doesn't get released, it builds, silently, gradually, until one moment changes everything. I started noticing the signals, not the statements, but the behavior. Movement didn't fully stop. Warnings were still being issued. Positions weren't changing. It was like both sides had paused, but neither had stepped back. And that's a critical difference, because stepping back means de-escalation, but pausing, that just means waiting. Waiting for leverage, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the next move. And that's when it really clicked for me. This situation isn't stable. It's being managed, held together just enough to avoid immediate collapse. But underneath that surface, everything that caused the conflict is still there, unresolved, unsettled, unpredictable. And when that's the case, time doesn't fix the problem, it sharpens it. By now, I wasn't looking at headlines anymore, because headlines were still using words like peace, progress, stability, but none of that matched what I was seeing. What I saw was a situation where nothing fundamental had changed. The same tensions were still there, the same disagreements were still unresolved, the same goals were still clashing, just temporarily paused. And that's when I realized the uncomfortable truth. This wasn't a peace process, it was pressure management, a way to slow things down without actually solving anything. And history has a pattern with situations like this. When conflicts pause without resolution, they don't disappear. They return, sometimes quietly, sometimes all at once, but always with more intensity than before. And that's exactly what this feels like, because even now no one has truly stepped back. No one has truly compromised. Everyone is still holding their position, just waiting, waiting for leverage, waiting for advantage, waiting for the moment where they can push again. And in that kind of environment, peace isn't fragile. It's temporary. And standing here, looking at the full picture, I can't help but think this story isn't ending anytime soon. In fact, it feels like we're still at the beginning. So after everything I've seen, everything I've followed, I can't call this peace, because peace doesn't look like this. Peace doesn't come with contradictions. It doesn't come with threats still hanging in the air. It doesn't come with threats still hanging in the air. It doesn't come with players preparing for the next move. What we're watching right now isn't the end of a war. It's a pause inside it. A moment where everything slows down just enough to make it look like it's over. But underneath, nothing has really changed. The same pressures are building. The same lines are drawn. The same risks are growing. Quietly. And the truth is, when a conflict reaches this level, it doesn't end with announcements. It ends when the reasons behind it are resolved. And right now, they're not. Which means this story is still moving, still evolving, and what comes next might be even bigger than what we've already seen. A ceasefire isn't peace, it's just silence before the next decision. It's just silence before the next decision. And in conflicts like this, silence can be more dangerous than war.